Thank you. Thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you to SAR, especially for this fellowship. I'm just going to sort of dive right in. Can you all hear me okay? So my colleague, Donna Haraway, uses the word sympoiesis to mean making with. As she says, nothing makes itself. As will become clear, this talk constitutes an intellectual sympoiesis, and I want to acknowledge my gratitude for those who have taught me, many living and some beyond living. I won't say dead because, as you'll see, I'm not really sure what dead is anymore. Indeed, ghosts begin and end this paper, so I'll cite another line from Haraway's Staying with the Trouble. Without sustained remembrance, we cannot learn to live with ghosts, and so cannot think. That remembrance is not just intellectual, and I want to remember and acknowledge that I'm standing here as a visitor on land that is not mine. This talk uses ghosts as a way to think into a still evolving second book project, and I would welcome hearing about your own encounters with ghosts and the uncanny, so if you have them, come and see me afterwards. Rather than an overarching argument, I'm going to give you various nodes of my book project. Some parts are open-ended speculation, and other parts are critical, even polemical, although I think of the two as working together. As a final word before I begin, and in line with what I just said about intellectual sympoiesis as a feminist ethic and practice, it's important that we acknowledge those on whom we draw. For those of you watching online, that means citing this talk, which is based on previously unpublished work, if you draw on its ideas, and there is a citation for the talk right there on the slide. I should also add that this talk is highly abstract and conceptual at times, and I hope that you can bear with me, but sprinkled along the way are treats in the form of various animals, and especially cats, which is how I will begin. I never thought much about ghosts until my cat Hoppy died. Like most cats, Hoppy always loved to stick her paw in my water glass and then knock it over. She also loved to topple vases so that she could eat the flowers. One day in July 2016, I came home to my Oakland apartment with a small bunch of flowers, which I put in a water glass and put on my bedside table. A few hours later, as I was sitting in my living room, I heard a crash and I went to investigate. The water glass had been knocked over and flowers were strewn on the floor. The windows were closed, so it wasn't the wind, and there had been no earthquake, not even a minor tremor. Hoppy was nowhere to be seen, but it was clearly her doing. Hoppy was nowhere to be seen because she was dead. 4 days earlier, as she lay in my lap in that same apartment, I had watched her eyes go dull as life left her body. I had bought the flowers as an offering to some vague notion of her spirit. But, much to my surprise, and despite being dead, there she was again in immaterial and invisible form, overturning a water glass to claim her flowers. My book project is an attempt to think through this moment when multiple things I knew to be true. It's Hoppy, but she's dead. It's her ghost, but ghosts aren't real. When all of those things collided. In that moment, my own secular sensibilities and my understanding of reality were shaken, and they have not quite stabilized. Anthropologist Susan Harding might say that in that moment, I came under some kind of secular, non-secular conviction, and that since then, I have been standing in the gap, as she puts it, between conscious belief and willed unbelief. Standing in the gap, I have been wondering about the epistemological limits of secularity and what happens when one crosses them, when one falls, or is pushed by a cat ghost, into this gap. The post-colonial historian Dipesh Chakrabarti has aptly noted that the secular academy has problems in handling practices in which gods, spirits, or the supernatural have agency in this world. This is in large part because the academy remains tethered to the notion that humans are the only agents, a position philosopher Charles Taylor calls exclusive humanism and identifies as a crucial component for the emergence of secularity. Exclusive humanism itself was made possible, Taylor writes, and I'm quoting him, by a new sense of the self and its place in the cosmos, not open and porous and vulnerable to the world of spirits and powers, but rather buffered. The new political and scholarly focus on the Anthropocene and cataclysmic climate change seeks to destabilize exclusive humanism and its buffered, bounded human, making us aware of what novelist Amitav Ghosh calls the urgent proximity of non-human presences. An efflorescence of what I'll call, acknowledging that it's a contested term, post-humanist scholarship or post-humanism, the ontological turn, new animism studies, multispecies and animal studies, and certain trends in STS. This scholarship has sought to present humans as always already in relation to non-humans, to recognize the agency of non-humans and things, and to conceive of human flourishing as deeply entangled in the flourishing of non-human worlds. Moreover, rather than conceiving of nature and culture as separate domains, many post-humanist scholars use the term nature culture, one word, to resuture the separation between nature and humanity that emerged with European modernity. In re-emphasizing the porousness of human subjects and their vulnerability to and dependence on non-human actors or agents, post-humanism might then be understood as a post-secular project. But these attempts to re-entangle the human and non-human and to recognize the agency of non-humans, even as they disrupt certain key elements of secularity, tend to privilege others. It's worth remembering that the modern conception of humanity emerged by disentangling man not only from the natural world, but from the supernatural one as well. As Thomas Hobbes wrote in Leviathan, man cannot make covenant, cannot make the social and political order with either brute beasts or God. Yet recent attempts to make covenant with non-humans and to re-entangle man as a being always in relation seem to welcome the presence of the natural and to falter at the presence of the supernatural. Consider Amitav Ghosh again. What does he mean by the urgent proximity of non-human presences? In his recent nonfiction book on climate change called The Great Derangement, he takes us to the Sundarbans, the massive mangrove forests in the low-lying Bengal Delta, now seriously threatened by rising sea levels. In the Sundarbans, he writes, tigers are everywhere and nowhere. You may not see them, but you see their prints, and you know that they are watching you. He then turns to a Sundarbans folk epic that tells of a meeting between a tiger and a boy named Duki. Quote, to look into the tiger's eyes is to recognize a presence of which you are already aware, and in that moment of contact, you realize that this presence possesses a similar awareness to you, even though it is not human, unquote. Ghosh writes that this moment has something of the uncanny about it, an irreducible element of mystery, he says. Moreover, he continues, and I'm quoting, it is surely no coincidence that the word uncanny has begun to be used in relation to climate change to express the strangeness of what is unfolding around us. For these changes are not merely strange in the sense of being unknown or alien, their uncanniness lies precisely in the fact that in these encounters we recognize something we had turned away from, that is to say, the presence and proximity of non-human interlocutors, unquote. Now, what is interesting in Ghosh's discussion of non-human interlocutors is that the tiger in the folktale who encounters the boy Duki, Ghosh's primary example from which he spins this tale of human-non-human relating, that tiger is actually a tiger demon, Dobkin Rai. The demon has already made an earlier appearance in Ghosh's novel, The Hungry Tide, also set in the Sundarbans. There, Dobkin Rai is mentioned early in the book as a powerful demon king who is defeated by Bombibi, a benevolent force who, in an act of mercy, leaves half the tide country to Dobkin Rai and his demon hordes. The Hungry Tide ends with a catastrophic cyclone that brings two of the protagonists face to face with both death and a tiger, though, if they are in Dobkin Rai's territory, is a tiger in tide country ever simply a tiger? In fact, the storm itself may be the work of Dobkin Rai. According to locals, and I'm citing from the novel, whenever you have a storm like that, one that appears suddenly and out of nowhere, you know it's the doing of Dobkin Rai and his demons. In The Hungry Tide, then, Ghosh seems to play with the entanglement of the natural and the supernatural, the cyclone and the demon king, and to highlight this nexus precisely in the kind of cataclysmic climate events that become the basis for the Great Derangement. The Hungry Tide, however, is a novel, and therefore less beholden to what we might call reality. In The Great Derangement's invocation of Dobkin Rai, Ghosh very quickly sets aside any non-secular aspects of the Sundarbans folktale, translating it into secular terms where non-human means tigers and forests, not tiger demons and other supernatural beings. Yet Ghosh also seems to know, even if he is fully unable to admit, that he cannot disentangle the tiger and the tiger demon, the natural and the supernatural, and so, calling it the uncanny, he keeps conjuring forth the tiger demon as integral to the stories he wants to tell about non-human presences and climate change. As he grasps for language to articulate the cyclone and climate change, it is to Dobkin he continually returns, only to then turn away. Dobkin doesn't just haunt the Sundarbans, he haunts Ghosh too. Despite the author's best efforts to turn the tiger demon into a tiger, the demon keeps disrupting Ghosh's story. Ghosh, of course, is not the only one who finds it easier to write about tigers than about tiger demons. The Academy has been much more open to accepting mountains, mosquitos, mollusks, and microbes as actually existing beings and agential actors than it has ghosts, demons, and other spirits. Even in the recent edited collection, Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet, Ghosts and Monsters of the Anthropocene, one half of which is dedicated to monsters and the other half to ghosts, the ghosts are strictly metaphorical. The editors write, and I quote, "Rather than imagining phantasms outside of natural history, the monsters and ghosts of this book are observable parts of the world," unquote. In other words, the supernatural has proved difficult to include in expanded notions of life, personhood, and the non-human. Why this is so, I want to argue, has something to do with secular modern attachments to the material, the visible, and the observable as sites of the real, attachments that continue to underpin the post-humanist turn. I also want to argue, however, that read generously against the grain, certain strands of post-humanism can offer ontological and epistemological horizons beyond the material and open us up to new worlds. In her book, The Companion Species Manifesto, about human-dog relationships, the influential feminist and post-humanist theorist Donna Haraway writes that there are no pre-constituted subjects and objects, and this is where the talk gets a little conceptual. There are no pre-constituted subjects and objects, rather, and I'm quoting her, there are only contingent foundations. Bodies that matter are the result. Dogs, she continues, are about the inescapable contradictory story of relationships, co-constitutive relationships in which none of the partners pre-exist the relating. So I'm going to read that again. There are no pre-constituted subjects and objects. There are only contingent foundations. Bodies that matter are the result. Dogs are about the inescapable contradictory story of relationships, co-constitutive relationships in which none of the partners pre-exist the relating. But how are we to read Haraway's reference to matter? Can bodies matter in immaterial ways? Can immaterial beings also matter? The significance of Haraway's argument seems to be the relating, where the materiality of dog is merely contingent as the contingency of relating itself. But is this the case, or does her argument assume material existence as the precondition for relating? Feminist science studies scholar Karen Barad is useful to think with here. In her book, Meeting the Universe Halfway, she proposes that rather than taking our primary ontological units as independent objects with independently determinate boundaries and properties, we think in terms of what physicist Niels Bohr called phenomena, premised on the ontological inseparability of what Barad calls agentially interacting components or agentive entities. And I'm sticking with Barad's complicated language because she's doing something with it and trying to help us think anew about being, agency, and relationship. In contrast to the term interaction, then, which assumes that there are separate individual actors with agencies that precede their interaction, Barad proposes the notion of intra-action, which recognizes that distinct agencies and agentive entities, agents, emerge through intra-action. Put simply, acting entities with agency, phenomena, emerge through each other. They do not pre-exist this interaction. Phenomena is an interesting term, since it doesn't necessarily exclude non-material beings who, through their interaction with other material and non-material beings, constitute both themselves and an entangled set of agencies. Phenomena would not need to take material form in order to be phenomena in Bohr's own terms. But for Barad, materiality, the importance of matter as the ground of her claims, is assumed. She writes, and I quote, "Phenomena do not require cognizing minds for their existence. Phenomena are real material beings," unquote. To think of existence beyond human representation and cognition remains anchored, it seems, to a materialist epistemology and a materialist ontology. At the same time, Barad offers another way to think about materiality that emerges in a seeming slippage between phenomena as material beings and phenomena as having material effects. She follows her claim that phenomena are real material beings by noting, and I quote, "What is made manifest through technoscientific practices is an expression of the objective existence of particular material phenomena. Objectivity is a matter of accountability for what materializes, what comes to be," unquote. What scientific practice does, Barad argues, is give expression to objective existence of phenomena by attending to what materializes. But are material effects, what materializes, necessarily coextensive with material beings? One could argue that a cat ghost, the phenomenon of Hoppy as ghost, in knocking over a water glass produces a material effect, spilled water, and the spilled water, what materializes, objectively constitutes evidence for the phenomenon of a cat ghost. Though I think I'm pretty sure I'm reading Barad against herself, her framework nonetheless offers us the possibility of remaining within a materialist evidentiary regime without necessarily demanding that we remain tied to a materialist ontology. Barad ends meeting the universe halfway with the Brittle Star, an echinoderm closely related to the starfish. The Brittle Star has bioluminescent arms that continue to move and emit light after breaking off from its main body, often distracting predators to allow for escape. In a beautiful discussion of the Brittle Star as both metaphor for and embodiment of how we might think entanglement and interaction, Barad writes, and I quote, "Is this jettisoned limb simply a piece of organic-inorganic structure shuddering with remnant reflex energy, or a companion species helping out? At what point does the disconnected limb belong to the environment rather than the Brittle Star? Is contiguity of body parts required in the specification of a single organism? Can we trust visual delineations to define bodily boundaries? Can we trust our eyes? Connectivity," Barad concludes, "does not require physical contiguity." This passage helps me think in new ways about a world of spirits and ghosts and other immaterial beings. Does my cat continue to exist after her body has been cast off and incinerated? Does she remain in relation, a companion species in death as much as in life? Can we draw on Barad, Haraway, and other post-humanist scholars for inspiration in thinking about the interaction constitutive of non-human spirits and humans, even as we ask why it seems so difficult, even counterintuitive, to do so? Let's leave this up. So to explore that difficulty, I want to work through anthropologist Marisol de la Cadena's writing on Andean Tiracuna, whom she defines as sentient beings made of earth and water, or earth beings. Secular folk would call them mountains. The Tiracuna are part of an anti-extractivist indigenous activism in de la Cadena's studies in Peru, and de la Cadena wants, she writes, and I'm quoting, to take seriously, perhaps literally, the presence and politics of those actors, like Tiracuna, which, being other than human, the dominant disciplines assigned to the sphere of nature, where they were to be known by science, as mountains, or to the metaphysical and symbolic fields of knowledge, and I think by the latter she means philosophy and religious studies. By taking seriously, even literally, the presence of earth beings in politics, de la Cadena rightly wants to move beyond a notion of politics that hinges, she says, on the separation between nature and humanity. But this dual framing, nature and humanity, ignores the third term that also got disentangled, supernature. Just as the natural world had no business in politics, the domain of the human, neither did the supernatural. How then might we re-entangle humans with non-humans and in the process rethink politics without leaving the supernatural disentangled from this newly entangled nature culture? One of the few people working on the presence of angels and other supernatural beings in politics is anthropologist Amir Meyer. In an article called Invisible Armies on demonstrations against the Mubarak regime in pre-revolution Egypt and Egyptians' dream visions that map onto political events, Meyer considers, and I'm quoting, the role of invisible actors in historical events. Yet she seems to hesitate in this endeavor to take seriously, perhaps literally, these invisible actors. Early on in the piece, she writes that she cannot gauge the specific effects of supernatural actors in historical events. Rather, she wants to analyze what dreams can do when they are told and retold by their human dreamers. Quote, what kinds of spaces for commentary and critique do dream stories enable, she asks. How do they reconfigure the very ground of politics? This seems to sidestep her initial attempt to think through the role of invisible actors in historical events, since historical and political effects take place only via the discourse and actions of humans, of human dreamers. In contrast to de la Cadenia's Andean world, the realm of politics in Egypt remains fundamentally human in Meyer's telling. Meyer does not, or more to the point, I think, cannot, take the politically and analytically radical step de la Cadenia does in her work on Andean earth beings. De la Cadenia, remember, wishes to take seriously, perhaps literally, the presence in politics of those actors like Tirakuna. Now, my discussion of Meyer's excellent work is not meant as criticism, but rather as an invitation to ask why de la Cadenia is able to make that claim about Tirakuna and remain intelligible and persuasive to a scholarly audience, and her book, Earth Beings, has done incredibly well and is sort of influential in anthropology. So persuasive to a scholarly audience in a way that Meyer, who would be taking seriously, perhaps literally, the presence in politics of angels and even the Prophet Muhammad shaking hands with demonstrators in Tahrir Square, in a way that Meyer cannot. I think there are a few reasons why, and I'll spend the next parts of my talk exploring them. And as you'll see, de la Cadenia and my sort of discussion of de la Cadenia is a way into a much more free-ranging discussion, so I hope that you can stay with me. First, whereas Meyer's Muslim interlocutors are not usually seen as political allies with positive political and ethical models to offer, de la Cadenia's interlocutors are indigenous Andeans, usually understood as allies in secular progressive politics. Moreover, though de la Cadenia herself does not use the term, her work would fall under the umbrella of what is being called the new animism, which overlaps significantly with what others have called the ontological turn in anthropology, whereby personhood includes non-human beings. Indeed, indigenous ontologies of entanglements between humans and non-humans are increasingly held out as our best hope for living in the ruins of the Anthropocene. According to Danny Nave and Nurit Bird-David, quote, so-called primitive animism, once it is better understood in the way we suggest, i.e. as the working of relationality, can open another way of looking that can help us think about environmental crisis, unquote. In an essay in the recent and comprehensive Handbook of Contemporary Animism, Deborah Bird-Rose discusses Australian philosopher Val Plumwood, who, before her death, had been grappling with animism in order to, and I'm quoting Rose, in order to start up a major cultural rethink that Plumwood, like many others, believed was necessary, and to do so by talking with peoples who are now living with the kinds of understandings that we are seeking, end quote. Graham Harvey, the handbook's editor, puts this affective and intellectual investment in animism most bluntly, quote, researchers who learn among Amazonian indigenous peoples are, like Philippe Descola and Eduardo Viveros de Castro, at the forefront of multi- and interdisciplinary debates. The nature of the world, of humans, and all life is at stake, unquote. I am interested, as a scholar, in the figure of the indigenous animist at play in such contemporary scholarship, and in the utopian, almost salvific hope for the future of humankind, indeed the world that this figure offers. And I want to be clear that I'm talking about the figure of the animist in secular scholarship and in the secular imagination, rather than about actual local indigenous life worlds and indigenous activism. I'm talking about representations of those life worlds by and for a mostly secular, mostly non-indigenous audience. When Deborah Bird-Rose talks about peoples who are living with the understandings that we are seeking, I'm interested in this community of we and its search for those peoples. After all, the narrative of animist and hope, of animist as hope, resembles another dyad that historian and anthropologist Michel Rolph-Trouillot called constitutive to the West as we know it, namely the dyad of Utopia and the savage. And Trouillot, too, is talking about the savage, the so-called savage in 16th, 17th, and 18th century European thought, not actual native people at the time. The New World and the ostensible state of nature found there was the basis for much theorizing about universal truths about man and society. For the likes of Michel de Montaigne, Thomas More, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Daniel Defoe, writes Trouillot, the savage was an argument for a particular kind of utopia. For philosophers like Jonathan Swift and Thomas Hobbes, the savage was an argument against it. But what matters, Trouillot says, is the structure of the debate, and I'm quoting Trouillot. In defense of a particular vision of the world, the savage becomes evidence for a particular type of utopia in an argument about nature and the universal, about being and existence, and about the possible futures of humankind, unquote. Trouillot helps attune us, I think, to the historical, structural, and affective conditions of possibility for this renewed interest in animism, to the structure of desire that animates the redemptive figure of the animist. Recall what Graham Harvey, editor of the Handbook of Contemporary Animism, had to say. Researchers who learn among Amazonian indigenous people are, like Philippe Descola and Eduardo Viveros de Castro, at the forefront of multi- and interdisciplinary debates. The nature of the world, of humans and all life, is at stake, unquote. Now, the aforementioned Eduardo Viveros de Castro is a leading figure in the ontological turn in anthropology, which has come to dominate the discipline and offers what Viveros calls indigenous multinaturalism as a better alternative to the hegemonizing binary thinking of Western modernity. Intriguingly, the ancestors of the Tupi-Guarani, on whom Viveros de Castro has based his recent work, once provided the para-ethnographic foundation on which Montaigne crafted his essay on cannibals, based on interviews with 3 Tupi circa 1560, who had been brought to Europe to interview by these European philosophers. Shakespeare then used Montaigne's text for Gonzalo's description of the ideal commonwealth in The Tempest, and in the following century, Rousseau once again took up on cannibals, ending his discourse on the origins of inequality with the words of Montaigne's Tupi, by then so famous as to require no citation whatsoever. In his book, Cannibal Metaphysics, Viveros de Castro is, of course, trying to take seriously the cannibal not as figure, but as ontology, in order to disrupt modernist assumptions about nature and culture. Yet this juxtaposition across 500 years points to a genealogy and a structural logic at work that enfolds Viveros de Castro, perhaps against himself. It's difficult for me not to understand the pull of the animist as an integral part of Western modernity, rather than, as new animism scholars would have it, a disavowal of that West. After all, wouldn't a real disavowal of the West have to occur not only on an intellectual but also political level? Disavowal as, for instance, the end of the United States, as Melanie Yazzie put it 2 weeks ago, a political overturning that would in turn radically transform intersubjective relations between, for instance, indigenous and non-indigenous people in ways that I have yet to see the animism scholars fully comprehend, let alone advocate for. Now, my intention here is not to simply dismiss the import of new animism scholarship, nor do I mean to downplay the catastrophic consequences of the Anthropocene and the urgent need for solutions. Rather, I'm interested in why some figures and not others, some peoples and not others, become the objects through which secular modern hopes, fears, and desires get mediated and worked out, become the sites to where claims about human and non-human flourishing can be made. It's worth asking, for example, why spirit possession hasn't come to be seen as a valuable site for post-humanist theorizing about relationality, given that spirit possession conjures a person without strict boundaries. Anthropologist Janice Body, for instance, writes about women in Sudan who are possessed by Zayran, a species of jinn. Jinn are non-human spirits in the Islamic tradition. Even though Zayran are not always physically present in the possessed person, the spirit constituents of a possessed woman, Janice Body calls this combination of spirit and woman a non-self, which I think is an amazing term, The spirit constituents comprise an integral part of her, influencing her decisions and perceptions to the point where some women, Body says, speak of themselves as if they are pluralities, substituting we, nihna, for I, ana. Furthermore, since the spirits possess multiple women simultaneously, a woman's spirit-possessed self, or non-self, like her regular self, is unlikely to be individualistic, for possession by common spirits binds her to other women and spirits in ways quite different than those of conventional kinship. Djinn possession and other forms of spirit possession thereby disrupt a human-centric ontology, problematizing any notion of an autonomous monadic human and destabilizing conventional notions of human agency. Why, then, is this understanding of being in relation so much less compelling than an animist one? So why is this understanding of being in relation that spirit possession conjures so much less compelling than an animist one? Graham Harvey, and I keep coming back to poor old Graham Harvey, but Graham Harvey in his Handbook of Contemporary Animism offers an answer. Animism, he writes, and I'm quoting, is found in between, in the relating together of persons, often of different species, rather than within, in the possession of or by spirits. The figure of the animist offers a world conceptualized as a kind of horizontal diffusion of symmetrical or equal agencies across and between humans and non-humans, where the power of humans is actually rarely at risk. And frankly, this is probably clear, I think this world is a fantasy that elides the hierarchies, disciplinary practices, and modes of authority that constitute actual animist life worlds. In contrast to this world of egalitarian interdependence, possession is premised on a more vertical configuration of being in relation, where agency greater than the human is at play. There's also something about one within one, being inhabited by another that is not a microbe, but a powerful spirit that disturbs secular sensibilities. I think it's worth asking why this is so, and how, as a result, African and Islamic ways of being in the world and being with others have largely been left out as valuable to think and think with. In tracking the secular investment in the animist, it's also worth attending to the history of the category of animism and its relationship to the world's great religions, a framework that emerged with the secular. As religion was increasingly defined as a discrete sphere and a distinct experience, a parallel category of not quite or not yet religion ran alongside it, comprising of practices that came in the 19th century world religions paradigm to be called animism, fetishism, shamanism, totemism, etc. Historian Tomoko Masuzawa describes how that paradigm divided religions of the world between a progressive West that made history, Christianity, and a venerable East that preserved it, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, Confucianism, really everything but Christianity. But within this configuration, she writes, was a tertiary group of minor religions. The peoples of these small-scale tribal societies were thought to possess an unusually tenacious historical memory, but not historical consciousness. On the strength of this assumption, these societies were relegated to a position, in some sense, before history, or at the very beginning of history, hence primal. Mapped as primitive forms of religion, these minor religions were religion's other side, certainly not secular, but not quite religion either. Interestingly, for 19th century philosophers, philologists, and Orientalists, the very primalness of these minor religions made them valuable to think with about a series of universal truths. In 19th and early 20th century theories of man and the social, Masuzawa notes, primitive tribal religions were expressions of some basic and natural human propensities and behaviors in the face of the mysterious and the supernatural. Unlike these generic minor religions, the great religions were thought to be culturally and historically particular, as they were predicated on specific defining events and associated with specific historical personages. They were historical. Primitive religions gestured to the human universal, albeit in primordial form, in a way that world religions could not. There are two threads I want to pull at here. The first concerns the logic of universal versus particular that structures the distinction between animism and other minor religions and great non-Christian religions like Islam or Hinduism. Although the new animism has cast aside an explicitly evolutionary frame, it nonetheless seems to have brought with it the old ascription of universality to the indigenous animist. For most of these secular progressive scholars, indigenous knowledge and indigenous ontologies of relationality are not simply one way to be. They are simultaneously the best way we could live and the real way we do live, even though we secular moderns may not realize it. It is difficult to imagine secular modern scholarship making such universalist claims on the basis of the major world religions. And it's also worth pointing out how inscribing oneself into an indigenous paradigm that now becomes a universal we flattens distinctive communal histories of differential violence, and in so doing softens or domesticates what justice might look like in the present and the future. The second thread is related to the first one. In a world in which the secular continues to define itself against religion proper, the world religions of Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, etc., not quite religions like animism can become an easier site of recuperation and even redemption for secular moderns trying to think and live beyond the stale confines of the conventionally secular. In a recent essay, Vincent Lloyd inquires into the embrace of indigeneity on the political left in this spiritual but not religious era. In a secular age where individuals are so atomized, he says, this investment in indigeneity embraces the pull of local community and tradition thought to be lost to secular moderns. And here's where things get weird and really interesting, I think. This search for redemption and meaning amidst the alienation of the secular and in the catastrophic wake of the Anthropocene, and the way in which the new animism has become a descriptive and prescriptive model for living in a world with others, in many ways mirrors the dominant understanding of what religion has been in the secular imagination. It is commonplace for secular moderns to see religious revivalism as the search for existential comfort in times of uncertainty, just as it is common for them to understand religion as both an explanation of the world and an ethic for living in it. At the end of the world as they know it then, some secular moderns seem to have found in indigenous animism religion as they themselves defined it for a secular age. Okay, so that ends the polemical part of my talk. So let me come back to the question now with which I began this discussion, namely, why can Marisol de la Cadena's claim to take seriously, perhaps literally, the presence and politics of Tiracuna, or earth beings, why can this claim stick in a way that Amir Emitter likely could not, were she to make the same claim about angels and djinn and dream visions? I just discussed the affective and historical pull of animism as one possible reason for the Tiracuna's intelligibility. I now want to work through a different answer. I think it matters that Tiracuna are, as de la Cadena puts it, made of earth and water, that they take visible material form as mountains, or form that is recognizable via ocular perception as material. The Tiracuna thereby become real in a way that angels and dream visions are not. This materialist epistemology, which I elaborated in my earlier discussion of Karen Barad, this materialist epistemology makes it difficult to account for the presence of creatures like djinn, who remain formless and invisible until they choose to make themselves perceptible to certain humans. Add to this the reorganization of the senses that came with modernity and the hegemony of the eye as the primary organ of perceiving and knowing, what Charles Hirschkind has called a modernist ocular-centric epistemology. Consider all this, and one begins to better understand the relationship between the visible and the real that emerges with the Enlightenment and continues to endure. Once again, Barad is both a way into and out of that materialist epistemology. Recall her formulation in her discussion of the Brittle Star. Let me put the Brittle Star back. So in her formulation of the Brittle Star, she writes, is contiguity of body parts required in the specification of a single organism? Can we trust visual delineations to define bodily boundaries? Can we trust our eyes? Barad's reference to trusting our eyes at once invokes a modernist ocular-centric epistemology and undercuts it. Connectivity, she concludes, does not require physical contiguity. In other words, no, we cannot trust our eyes, or rather, we cannot trust only our eyes. My point is that human perception cannot define the bounds of the universe or multiverse. Indeed, wouldn't a true post-humanism entail the possibility of modes of existence that we humans simply cannot know or know easily because they remain inaccessible to common sensory perception? Wouldn't it also entail the possibility of multispecies entanglements in shared worlds that don't include or are hidden to us humans? It turns out, for example, that cats, everything always comes back to cats, like many non-human animals, can see in ultraviolet, a light spectrum invisible to humans. So an article on this phenomenon puts it, quote, "A house cat's bizarre antics may be more than just feline folly. The kitty may be seeing things that the human eye cannot," unquote. In a description of djinn, which he describes as sentient organisms of so fine a nature and of a physiological composition so different from our own that they are not normally accessible to our sense perception, the late Islamic scholar Muhammad Asad writes, and I quote, "If we assume, as we must, that there are living organisms whose biological premises are entirely different from our own, it is only logical to assume that our physical senses establish contact with them only under very exceptional circumstances, hence the description of jinn as invisible beings," unquote. As you might tell, I find the jinn particularly compelling to think with about multi-species worlds. In Islamic theology and cosmology, jinn are a separate species of being, different from and older than humans. They are made of smokeless fire and are generally imperceptible to humans, though jinn can perceive humans and intervene in their lives. Jinn mate and procreate, though they do not have the same biology or anatomy as humans. Interestingly, the Quran is addressed to both humans and jinn, so ethical action in the Islamic tradition is multi-species from its inception. And some jinn still alive today are counted among the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet Muhammad who heard his recitation of the Quran. Anand Vivek Taneja, whose recent book, Genealogy, explores interactions between humans, animals, and jinn saints in an old 14th century Mughal fort in Delhi, India, Taneja writes that because the lifespans of jinn do not correspond to human time, jinn can transmit knowledge and traditions beyond all possibility of human memory. Taneja also sees jinn as promoting the possibility of multi-species kinship, since jinn are renowned shapeshifters and the line between jinn and animals is always blurry. Work on cryptozoological species, or cryptids. Has anyone heard of cryptids? Cryptids is also fascinating. So cryptids are categories of animals which some groups of humans consider real, but are not recognized by international zoology. For most cryptozoologists, cryptids are either unknown species of animals, or those that are thought to be extinct but have actually survived the vicissitudes of modernity. Cryptids are known only indirectly through what is commonly called myth, superstition, or local knowledge, or are merely suspected to exist, having somehow survived modernity. Like jinn, cryptids occupy a realm of the unseen, escaping human perception, though not necessarily the capacity for human perception. While zoologists consider cryptozoologists illegitimate as scientists because their entire enterprise is speculative and not based in a kind of empirical reality, it's worth remembering the former cryptids who turned out to be real. The Komodo dragon, thought by Europeans to be a mythical beast until its discovery by scientists in 1926, and the coelacanth, a survivor from 80 million years ago known as the living fossil fish, found in 1938 in the waters near the Comoros Islands. As for the devil bird, only heard and never seen in the jungles of Sri Lanka, but whose blood-curdling shrieks are thought by locals to foreshadow death, cryptozoologists have proposed multiple likely candidates: the forest eagle owl, the crested honey buzzard, and the Ceylon highland nightjar. The bird, however, or whatever it is, remains unseen to any of the humans involved, local or scientist. So I want to conclude our journey with the Golden Snail Opera, a multi-species choreography in which, through video and text, various beings on a Taiwanese rice field offer what the opera's authors call their enactments of living in common. The speaking characters in the opera are the farmer, who has taken up farming practices friendly to other species, the pedant, who explains the story in rational scientific terms, and the wanderer, a roaming ghost whose living life was ended by American bombs during World War II. The accompanying film features the perspectives of a snail, a dog, and humans. When the opera is performed on stage, the roaming ghost intrudes on the humans, standing in front of them and nudging them, but the pedant sees and hears nothing, and the farmer only feels the ghost's presence as cold air on the back of her neck. And I want to play. You get the point. They mounted a camera on the dog. So the opera raises a number of questions for me. Can the dog and the snails know, can they see the ghost in ways that humans cannot? When the dog with a camera mounted on his back suddenly pauses mid-gambol and looks intently at something in the field, what might he be perceiving, probably smelling, that we humans cannot? A few more questions. Could we retrain our modernist sensory capacities to perceive the ghost and other such beings? Could we draw on existing traditions of thought and practice to cultivate porousness in order to perceive differently and open ourselves up to new worlds? And like the cryptids, do some of those capacities endure unbeknownst to us, what Michel Foucault called subjugated knowledges, sparked momentarily by the appearance of cat ghosts and the like? It seems difficult, the Golden Snail opera concludes, and I'm citing directly, it seems difficult to ban ghosts from the annals of those doing natural history as well as those being observed. This, of course, messes with European notions of nature, but isn't that part of the point? Indeed, fully undoing the nature-culture distinction, I want to argue, requires attending to that third domain, the supernatural, still banished from our epistemological and ontological horizons. A fuller account of humans as beings always in relation with non-humans requires that we think more capaciously about what constitutes the non-human. So not just nature culture then, but supernature culture. So I want to end with a coda to the story of my cat with which I began. The first time I told that story in public, the presenter who went before me fainted at the podium. The second time, preparing for my presentation, I got myself a glass of water, set it on the table, and sat down to adjust my microphone. Before I could begin, my glass overturned, spilling water everywhere. My opening anecdote then about the ghost of my dead cat overturning a water glass was immediately preceded by an overturned water glass. Make of that story what you will. Thank you.